Welcome to today's deep dive. Whether you are prepping for a major meeting right now, or maybe trying to make sense of global history during your commute, or you're just, insanely curious and looking to expand your worldview today.
You are definitely in the right place.
You really are. We have a heavy, and I mean incredibly fascinating stack of material to get through today that is going to challenge some deeply entrenched historical narratives.
Right. It requires a willingness to look at the actual mechanics of global events, how empires expand, how laws are written, how economies are structured, but looking at them through a completely different lens. We are looking at the architecture of power today.
That is the perfect way to form it, the architecture of power. So our mission today is to unpack this highly thought-provoking blog post. It was published on a site called Knowledge is King.
By Mark Wells, right?
Exactly. Written by Mark Wells on March 7, 2026. And it carries a title that immediately just grabs your attention. It's called The Great Contradiction: Why Islam Remains the Final Frontier Against Western Hegemony.
That is a title that does not pull any punches.
No, not at all. We are going to dive deep into his historical and philosophical arguments today. He basically makes the case that Islamic legal and economic frameworks have, for centuries, systematically pushed back against Western colonial narratives.
And that they continue to do so today. But just to set some groundwork before we get into the weeds here, Wells is tackling some very heavy, very charged themes.
Very charged.
So we're talking about Western hegemony, the legacy of colonialism, the intersection of religion, law, and state power. So our role today isn't to play judge or jury on his politics.
Right.
We are not taking sides. We aren't endorsing a left-wing view or a right-wing view. We are just here to impartially map out the architecture of his argument so you, the listener, can evaluate it yourself.
Exactly. We are just your guides to the text today, keeping it strictly objective. Okay, let's unpack this. The author's central premise rests on flipping a very old script.
A very old script.
Yeah. Wells argues that for centuries, the global stage has been dominated by this Judeo-Christian coalition that historically justified its global expansion, its colonization, as this noble civilizing mission.
The narrative was always framed as bringing order, law, and enlightenment.
Right, to places that were supposedly characterized by barbarianism.
But the text immediately introduces a really sharp critique of that framing. He cites critics who argue that this so-called civilizing mission was, in practice, a form of what he calls Caucasian barbarianism.
Caucasian barbarianism.
Yes. The author uses that phrase to describe a moral veneer. It was a way of painting over the raw, aggressive pursuit of land, power, and resources with this incredibly thin coat of religious and legal self-righteousness.
Because if you label non-Western societies as lawless, right, colonial powers could just use their own specific legal standards as the only acceptable yardstick.
Exactly. That framework automatically justified the displacement and the subjugation of millions of people, simply because they supposedly lacked civilization.
And this is where Wells brings Islam into the picture. Not just as a differing theology, but as the ultimate wrench in the gears of that colonial narrative.
A massive wrench.
According to the text, the Islamic world didn't just passively disagree with the West. It offered a robust, highly developed competing legality. It essentially stripped the civilizing mission of its moral authority.
And to understand the mechanics of how that resistance actually functioned, we have to look at the first major theme the author presents.
The legal war.
The legal war, yes. And specifically, we need to examine this foundational colonial legal doctrine known as Terra Nullius.
Terra Nullius, which translates essentially to nobody's land.
Right.
But the way it was applied historically was far more insidious than just, sailing along and finding an empty island.
Oh, absolutely. It was the legal loophole of the century for colonial expansion. Terra Nullius was the doctrine that a piece of land essentially belonged to no one and was therefore legally up for grabs if it lacked a recognizable Western-style government or legal system.
So if the local population didn't have courts or property deeds or parliaments that looked identical to the ones operating in London or Paris,
then the colonizing powers simply declared a legal vacuum.
a vacuum. So if the legal justification for expansion relied entirely on finding the supposed vacuum, the colonizing powers actually needed societies to be disorganized.
They depended on it.
But the author points out a massive historical contradiction here. When European powers encountered Islamic societies, they hit an absolute brick wall.
A legal brick wall.
Right. Wells uses the Sokoto Caliphate in West Africa as a prime example of this. This wasn't some loose, unstructured territory.
Not at all.
The Sokoto Caliphate in the 19th century was a massively complex state. We're talking millions of citizens, a specialized judiciary, standardized taxation, formalized borders. You couldn't just plant a flag and claim nobody was in charge.
And the same applied to the vast territories of the Ottoman Empire. The text highlights that these Islamic scholars possessed incredibly sophisticated, centuries-old systems of land ownership, human rights, and international diplomacy.
Yeah, the author specifically points to the concept of CR.
CR, yes. And this wasn't just a set of loose religious guidelines. CR was an established, complex framework for international law.
Operating way before Europe formalized its own.
Way before. It regulated treaties, diplomacy, the treatment of foreigners, the rules of engagement during wartime, all operating long before European powers formalized their own international legal systems like we know them today.
And the most undeniable proof of this legal sophistication, which Wells really leans into heavily in the piece, was the missal.
The missal is fascinating. The Ottoman Empire took this vast, diffuse body of Islamic jurisprudence and they codified it. They turned it into a systematic, modern civil code. That was the missal.
And the author compares it directly to the Napoleonic Code in Europe, right?
Directly. By producing this massive, standardized legal document in the late 19th century, covering everything from contracts to torts to procedural law, the Ottomans definitively proved to European powers that their legal system was incredibly organized.
And entirely capable of governing a modern state bureaucracy.
Exactly. It completely dismantled the narrative that these were lawless lands waiting to be civilized by a superior European power.
There was no vacuum to fill.
None. And Wells provides a really striking historical anecdote to drive this point home, specifically regarding the ethics of war and who actually possessed the moral high ground.
This part really stuck out to me. He brings up Emir Abd al-Qadir.
Yes, the leader of the resistance in Algeria.
Right, against the French invasion in the mid-19th century. The contrast the text draws here is just jarring.
It is.
While the invading European armies were utilizing these brutal, scorched earth tactics, destroying crops, leveling entire villages, essentially engaging in total war against civilian populations to break their morale.
Emir Abd al-Qadir was doing the exact opposite.
He was strictly adhering to Islamic legal mandates regarding the ethical treatment of prisoners of war and non-combatants.
The text notes that Abd al-Qadir would even release enemy prisoners if he couldn't secure enough food to feed them, according to the humane standards dictated by Islamic law.
Which is wild to think about in the context of war.
The historical irony here is profound. The invading forces, who arrived flying the banner of civilization and legal superiority, were the ones operating with unchecked brutality.
Meanwhile, the local leader defending his sovereign land?
The one explicitly labeled by the invaders as a barbarian.
Right. He was the one strictly upholding a humane, codified, ethical standard of conduct.
It totally flips the script on the colonial narrative.
It really does. The so-called civilized invaders looked like the true barbarians when you examine the actual historical record of their conduct.
I want you to consider how concepts like lawlessness or civilization are almost exclusively defined by those who are seeking to justify their own conquests.
They get to write the dictionary.
Exactly. When a coalition has the power to write the international dictionary, they get to decide who the barbarian is. The text forces us to look past the self-serving labels of empire and examine the raw legal and ethical reality on the ground.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Wells doesn't let the analysis stop at the legal battles. He shifts the deep dive from the courtroom to the bank vault.
The second major theme: economic sovereignty.
Right, because if the legal justification for expansion was crumbling because they couldn't claim Terra Nullius, the colonizing powers needed a different lever of global control.
And Wells argues that lever was debt.
Debt. He inextricably links the power of this Western coalition to a very specific economic engine: interest-based banking and sovereign debt.
To control the world, you need to fund military and infrastructure expansion. And that funding came through a globalized system of lending and compound interest.
But again, Islam presented a completely different economic DNA that fundamentally resisted that model.
The text highlights two foundational economic concepts here. First, the radical prohibition of riba, which is usury or interest.
And second, the heavy emphasis on zakat, which is obligatory charity and communal welfare.
When you put a debt-based economy up against a system built on those principles, the friction is just obvious.
Yeah, they cannot mix.
A debt-based economy, by its very mathematical nature, consolidates wealth and creates systemic dependency. The lender always holds political and economic leverage over the borrower.
We saw this historically when European debt traps led directly to the loss of sovereignty in places like Egypt.
Exactly. But an economy that strictly forbids interest and legally mandates the continuous circulation of wealth through zakat is fundamentally incompatible with colonial finance.
It is an entirely different philosophy of money.
It's designed to prevent the exact kind of financial hegemony that fueled Western expansion.
And Wells provides this incredible historical proof of concept for this alternative system in action, the Hijaz Railway.
Hijaz Railway. The text frames the railway not merely as an infrastructure project, which is a profound act of macroeconomic defiance.
Defiance is the right word. For those who don't know, the Hijaz Railway was a massive, highly complex engineering undertaking in the early 1900s. It was designed to connect Damascus to Medina across incredibly harsh terrain.
To make the pilgrimage to Mecca easier.
Right. But the mind-blowing part is the financing. Wells frames it as a historical version of global crowdfunding.
Crowdfunding before the internet.
Exactly. It was financed entirely by the Ummah, the global Muslim community. People from all over the world, from civil servants to everyday citizens, donated what they could. They bought stamps. They contributed to the fund.
And the geopolitical implications of that are massive. This monumental piece of modern infrastructure was built without a single cent of European debt.
It is actually wild to think about infrastructure on that scale being funded by a global community without relying on institutional Western banking.
It proved that large-scale progress, technological modernization, and faith could thrive entirely independently of Western financial dependency.
Because if there's no debt, there's no leverage.
Precisely. The colonizing powers couldn't use debt as leverage to control the railway, or by extension the region, because there simply was no debt. No foreign loans meant no foreign board of directors dictating Ottoman regional policy.
Okay, so if the West couldn't use the lawless excuse to conquer them legally, and they couldn't use sovereign debt to control them economically, what was their countermove, according to Wells?
This leads us into the third theme, the geopolitical fear of transnational unity.
According to the text, the ultimate nightmare scenario for the Western coalition was a unified Muslim political identity, the concept of pan-Islamism.
Think about it. Millions of people, stretching across multiple continents, united not by arbitrary borders or ethnic race, but by a shared belief system and a shared legal and economic framework.
That is a massive block.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how pan-Islamism represented an existential threat to the colonial project. You cannot divide and conquer a global population that fundamentally refuses to be divided.
So the text outlines two very specific modern geopolitical strategies that the West employed to neutralize this threat of unity.
Strategy number one, ethnic nationalism.
The author argues that the West actively worked to break the overarching political unity of the caliphate by exploiting and amplifying ethnic lines.
The goal, as the text explains, was to convince Arabs, Turks, and Persians that their ethnic, linguistic, and geographic divisions were fundamentally more important than their religious and political unity.
Right. If you can convince a population to identify primarily with a newly drawn national border,
or a specific ethnic subgroup.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Rather than the global ummah, you fracture their collective bargaining power.
You replace a massive unified bloc with smaller, competing nation-states. And those nation-states are much easier to manage, influence, or conquer individually.
It is the oldest playbook in empire building.
It really is.
But they didn't rely solely on nationalism. The second strategy, the author points out, is essentially a brutal branding exercise, the fanatic label.
And this ties directly back to what we discussed earlier about defining the terms of the conflict to legitimize violence.
Wells uses the example of the Senussia in Libya to illustrate this. The Senussia wasn't just some random band of fighters. They were a deeply organized Sufi order that had built trade networks, schools, and legal courts all across the region.
They were an established societal structure.
Right. So when Italy launched its colonization efforts in Libya, the Senussia mounted a highly organized, legally sound military resistance to defend their sovereign land.
But the colonizing powers didn't refer to them as a lawful army or a legitimate legal resistance.
No. They deliberately rebranded them in the international press as religious fanatics.
And the power of that label dictates the rules of engagement.
How so?
Well, if you acknowledge you are fighting a legitimate legal resistance defending its homeland, you are engaged in a formal war, which comes with international scrutiny, treaties, and rules regarding the treatment of combatants.
Like we saw with Abba al-Qadir.
Exactly. But if you unilaterally declare that you are simply policing religious fanaticism, you grant yourself the rhetorical justification to use overwhelming, unregulated military force.
Because you aren't conquering a sovereign people, you're just pacifying a dangerous element.
The text argues this strategy was repeatedly used to delegitimize any structured Islamic resistance to Western hegemony, painting rational defense of land and law as irrational zealotry.
It is a dark public relations strategy that completely shielded colonial powers from accountability. Now, to fully grasp the weight of these arguments, I think we need to zoom out and look at the broader context of the author himself. Let's take a quick look at the source and what else Mark Wells writes about.
Understanding his broader intellectual focus really helps explain why he is analyzing Islamic history through this highly specific structural lens.
On his blog, Knowledge is King, you can see a very clear pattern in his other work. He has posts titled The Domino Effect, From Choke Points to Kitchen Tables.
And another one called The Great Disconnect, Why the Stock Market Smashes Records When Your Wallet is Empty.
Those titles reveal a writer deeply focused on the mechanics of global inequalities and modern macroeconomic systems.
He's dissecting the friction between late-stage capitalism and the microeconomic reality of everyday affordability.
So he isn't approaching Islam from a purely theological or spiritual angle. He's looking at it as a structural economist.
Which is precisely why his analysis of the Sokoto Caliphate or the Hijaz Railway makes so much sense. He views the Islamic tradition not just as a set of personal beliefs, but as the only surviving systemic alternative to the global economic and political structures he criticizes.
It is a system that has built-in economic firewalls, like the prohibition of interest, designed to resist the homogenization of global capitalism.
It acts as a counterweight.
So what does this all mean? When we pull all these threads together, the legal codes, the economic resistance, the geopolitical fracturing, why is Islam, as the title of his post suggests, the final frontier?
Wells synthesizes his argument by concluding that Islam remains the final obstacle to Western coalition hegemony because it is the only major worldview on the planet that absolutely refuses to be fully secularized.
And by secularized, he doesn't just mean people stopping their prayers. He means the privatization of religion.
Exactly that. The Western liberal model requires religion to be relegated entirely to the private domestic sphere, leaving the public sphere law, economy, statecraft, and sovereignty completely open to Western liberal capitalism.
And Islam structurally resists that privatization.
It stubbornly maintains its own autonomous definitions of the family, of legal contracts, and of social welfare. It possesses a complete, self-contained social and economic framework that simply does not bow to the demands of Western assimilation.
As long as it offers that functional, alternative social contract, it blocks the establishment of a single, homogenized global culture and economic system.
The author wraps up by making a very poignant observation.
Yeah, that the barbarianism of the past, that aggressive pursuit of power and resources disguised as a civilizing mission, has not vanished from the global stage. It hasn't disappeared. It has simply evolved its methods and modernized its terminology.
But, as the text concludes, the intellectual and structural resistance against it has also endured. And that resistance remains deeply rooted in the legal autonomy, the economic sovereignty, and the radical equality of the Islamic tradition.
It provides a massive perspective shift on how we view both global history and current geopolitical events. Unpacking these complex layers of history, law, and macroeconomics is no small feat, but it is incredibly rewarding.
It really challenges us to look beyond the immediate headlines, past the labels assigned by those in power, and to examine the underlying mechanics of how societies actually function and resist. This raises an important question, and I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over or explore on your own today.
Leave us with something to think about.
We discussed the historical reality of the Hijaz Railway earlier.
Right, the crowd-funded railway.
If a completely different historical framework could successfully fund massive infrastructure like the Hijaz Railway without a single cent of interest-based debt, what unbreakable rules of our modern global economy might actually be completely optional? We are constantly told that sovereign debt, compound interest, and leverage are the only realistic ways to build a modern world. But history provides tangible proof otherwise. What if the next major leap in global progress doesn't come from inventing a new technology, but from revisiting an ancient social contract?
Are the rules of the economic game actual laws of nature, or are they just the rules written by the current winners? That's a brilliant question to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material today. Keep questioning the narratives, keep learning, and we will catch you next time.